It is a pleasure to welcome back to the World Affairs Council Dr. Kirwin Shaffer from Penn State Berks. He is a professor of Latin American Studies. He teaches courses on Latin American and Caribbean history, Latin American studies, global terrorism, tyranny and freedom, globalization, and global cinema. When not teaching, he continues research on transnational anarchism in the Americas. He has published 4 books on anarchist politics and culture in Latin America. 1, Anarchism and Countercultural Politics in Early 20th Century Cuba. 2, Anarchism, Anti-Authoritarianism, and the Left in Puerto Rico from 1897 to 1921. In Defiance of Boundaries, Anarchism in Latin American History. And finally, Anarchists of the Caribbean, Countercultural Politics and Transnational Networks in the Age of U.S. Expansion. Dr. Shaffer is currently writing his fifth book, tentatively entitled A Transnational History of the Modern Caribbean Resistance Across Borders. It is my pleasure to welcome back Dr. Shaffer.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. If I hold it here, can you hear me? Everything's good? Excellent, excellent, excellent. So I'm glad to be back. It's been about 7+ years since I was here. And last time I was here, I was talking on Cuba. And Cuba was starting to make an interesting transition. The United States had just opened up diplomatic relations with Cuba. This was late 2014, early 2015. Well, then those relations, took a back seat when a new administration came in, and the current administration isn't very anxious to bring about those relations anymore. But I'm glad to be back today to talk about a fascinating phenomenon that's of distinct interest to me. I'm a historian, and so, as you know from the titles of my books, I researched the late 19th, early 20th century, particularly left-wing politics, particularly radical left-wing politics. What I want to talk about today is this fascinating phenomenon that's going on in Latin America with a new leftward shift in politics across the region. It's something that we talk about in several of the classes that I teach at Penn State Berks, where I teach in our Global Studies program. It's a program that we've been doing for about 20 years now, and it's a program that is, it was the first that was created in the state of Pennsylvania. It's the oldest Global Studies program in the state, and our students study international politics, international history, international economics and business and culture. They do study abroad, and they often do international internships. And we've got graduates who right now are working everywhere from London to Auckland. And we're very, very proud of our program and of our students. So I know we have a lot of students here. If you're ever interested in global affairs, we'd be happy to talk to you as well. And now that my advertisement is over, on with the show. All right. Okay, so there's some fascinating stuff happening politically in Latin America today. If you look at a map of Latin America, there are currently 8 countries that have elected left-wing presidents, all right? All beginning in 2018 in Mexico, up to Brazil in 2022, which just elected a leftist president in October. But I want to add something else to this map. Besides these countries with elected left-wing presidents, we also have a few countries that have authoritarian left-wing presidents, whether it's Cuba or Nicaragua in Central America or Venezuela. But if you put all of this together, what we're looking at is a total of 11. And my apologies if people down here can't see. All right. 11 of Latin America's 19 Spanish and Portuguese-speaking countries are currently ruled by left-wing presidencies, either democratically elected or authoritarian. Okay. Now, why? Why this shift? Okay. 30 years ago, this would have been impossible. 40 years ago, definitely it would have been impossible because of the military dictatorships that dominated the region. In fact, 40 years ago, there were almost no democracies in Latin America. Today, almost every country is a democracy, some more free than others. All right? Well, this leftward shift that we see in Latin America today is what we euphemistically call a pink tide. Pink as in sort of leftist, socialist, not red as in communist, okay? This pink tide. But this one that we're seeing right now had a predecessor. 20 years ago, we started to see what was called the first pink tide. And what's intriguing about both of these, whether it's the early 2000s or today, is that both of them are intimately linked to a growing rejection of neoliberal capitalism. Now, when we talk about neoliberal capitalism, sometimes people just hear the capitalism and don't understand what the first part of that means. So what's been happening since the early 90s is we've seen a push around the world, and especially in Latin America, of trade liberalization, more free trade, getting rid of import and export tariffs, things like this, right? A push for privatization, deregulation, getting the government out of the economy especially. Reducing spending, reducing government subsidies for things like education, infrastructure, health care. Ending controls on foreign capital. So in other words, for much of Latin America's 20th century, there was an effort to try and restrict how much foreign businesses could come in. Well, now, neoliberalism wants to get rid of those restrictions and allow foreign corporations essentially to run, free throughout the country without any restrictions. This has all been sort of euphemistically called structural adjustment policies, all right? Or it's often referred to as the Washington Consensus. So what's happening in Latin America now, and what happened 20 years ago as a predecessor, is a rejection of this sort of neoliberal capitalism that's been inundating these countries. Now, in the early 2000s, this first pink tide, or this first pink wave, was itself created out of people going to the streets and saying, "Que se vayan todos," kick them all out. They were tired of the politicians who were responsible for creating these neoliberal policies that were making it almost impossible for people to afford education, etc. And so people started going to the streets in Argentina in 2001, and it started to create these direct democracies. A lot of businesses a lot of factories went out of business as the economy collapsed around 2001. And workers began to say, we're not responsible for these factories going out of business. Why should we suffer? And so workers began to take over 100 factories and businesses across Argentina and ran them themselves as worker-run democratic workplaces. Equal pay, equal say. Everybody was paid the same. There was no management. Everybody voted on how the factories would be run. Okay? It was a rejection of the neoliberal model. In fact, today, of those 100 original factories and businesses, 400 now exist in Argentina. All right? In Bolivia in the early 2000s, there was another mass movement from the bottom up that triggered a pink tide in Bolivia. The water systems in some of these countries are old and crumbling, and governments were refusing to pay for these. In part, they couldn't because they were so in debt that international lenders were saying, you have to pay off your debts before you invest in your water systems. And so as part of neoliberalism, the government starts selling off its water supply to private corporations. And suddenly, poor people found their water bills going up 200%. They couldn't pay the water bills. And they protested, and as a result of their protests, what came to be known as the Cochabamba Water Wars, the company had to leave. The government took over the water again. And in fact, a new government that came into power, the new government made it unconstitutional to privatize water. All right. Now, this first pink tide, and I just want to spend a little bit of time on this history before we look at today. This first pink tide, this first wave of left-wing governments, there were two types. There were some that are just sort of left of center. They're not much different than the Democratic Party in the United States, but left of center. And they were trying to control neoliberal capitalism. They were trying to put more government in regulation of the economy. But they were still fairly friendly with international business. They're not anti-capitalist, but they're anti-allowing capitalists to do whatever they want without regulations. Right? Michelle Bachelet was part of this left-wing tide in Chile. She's been elected president there twice. She just finished serving a 4-year stint as the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees. Very prominent person on the international stage. There was Lula in Brazil, who, if you know, was just re-elected in October in Brazil. There were the Kirchners in Argentina, a husband and wife duo. He was president. When he died, she became president. She is now currently the vice president, though has just been convicted of corruption charges in the last couple of weeks. All right? But what's really interesting about these people, not only did they come to power riding this anti-neoliberalism wave, but they also came to power and did something really phenomenal. They removed the amnesty laws. Now, what were these? When the military dictatorships ruled these countries in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they committed massive human rights abuses. In the 90s, as Latin American countries transitioned back to democracy, the governments granted amnesty to all of the human rights abusers. They couldn't prosecute them. Why? The military was too powerful still. And when they tried to prosecute them, the military would rise up in rebellion. So these human rights abusers, everywhere from the generals and the admirals, down to the kidnappers, down to the rapists, down to the torturers, down to the doctors, down to those people who kidnapped babies from dissidents, they all got off free. No prosecutions. These people, when they came to power riding this pink wave 20 years ago, they got rid of the amnesty laws. And to this day, human rights abusers are still being found and put on trial. Now, what's fascinating about these people's stories, every single person you see on here were themselves political prisoners of the dictatorships. They were all tortured by the dictatorships themselves. All right? Now, there was a second wave, a second type of left-wing government that came to power in the early 2000s. If what we just saw was a sort of democratic left-center wave, which reflects the democratic wave we see today, the authoritarian left was coming to power in the early 2000s. These were populists, they were socialists, they had friendly relations with Cuba. They were trying to create an anti-American sentiment. They were trying to create what they called a multipolar axis against the United States, which was linking themselves with allies around the world, Russia, China, Iran, trying to create this global multipolar axis to challenge U.S. foreign policy, but also to challenge the Washington consensus of neoliberal capitalism. So people like Evo Morales in Bolivia, who created a movement towards socialism, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, who created what he called 21st century socialism, explicit socialist programs. And again, just to not speak too much about this, but both types of left-wing governments then, and I argue today, cooperate in trying to counter the influence of the United States. This is a Latin America-wide leftist coalition designed to reduce the impact of U.S. foreign policy and to control the impact of foreign corporations in their countries. All right? They created this thing called ALBA, the Alternativa Bolivariana para las Americas, a coalition named after Simón Bolívar, the great independence fighter who helped liberate much of Latin America from Spanish control in the early 1800s. And again, they were trying to build this cooperation within Latin America to share health care, to share education resources, to share energy resources, not to make everything based upon the market, not to make everything dependent upon capitalist forces of supply and demand, all right? To be more economically independent as a region. Now, the problem is, by the 20-teens, the left is starting to fall back. There are criticisms from the left that say these left-wing governments were not doing enough to get rid of class disparities. They weren't doing enough to help indigenous peoples. They were still involved in extractive economies for export. And so by the 20-teens, the left is losing ground. The Brazilians, kick out Lula. Hugo Chavez dies, and a fairly authoritarian brute, Maduro, comes to power in Venezuela. The Obama administration helps to overthrow the government in Honduras in 2009. Jair Bolsonaro followed Donald Trump's lead in Brazil, became president, took the country on a rightward shift, and more and more. And yet, here we are. Here we are from 2018 to 2022 with all of these new leftist presidents. Whether it's Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who we see right here, who was the first leftist president elected in Mexico since the 1930s, all right? All the way around the Horn in Argentina and Bolivia, Peru. If you guys want to talk about the Peruvian guy, he's in the news this week. Down here to, trust me, there is a person down over here, okay? Okay. Down here, this is Xiomara Castro, who's the new president of Honduras. It was her husband who was overthrown in the U.S.-backed coup in 2009. She's now the president. All the way up to the latest, Lula in Brazil. Now, what are these people doing? Well, Brazil, for instance, Lula has been very adamant that Brazil is going to get back into climate talks and get back involved in the global climate discussions. All right, because under his first administration, deforestation of the Amazon really plummeted. But under his successor, Jair Bolsonaro, deforestation was on the rise again. And so he's pledging to stop the cutting down of the rainforests. In Argentina, the president there, hang on there, boss. In Argentina, when the new president came to power in 2019, he inherited this massive debt, all of this austerity, in which he said, we got to stop, the IMF said you've got to stop spending on education and healthcare and infrastructure and that sort of thing. And so what did he do? He started to say, okay, enough of the IMF, enough of working with the Washington Consensus, enough of the neoliberals. We're going to start working with China, Iran, Russia. And in fact, what you'll see in this map are all of these countries who are part of China's Belt and Road economic development initiative. Argentina is just tapping into something larger that's going on here as people are looking for alternatives to the U.S. All right. In Bolivia and Chile, they export things like copper and lithium. Lithium, a huge issue right now, huge for computer chips and technology. They were going to stop And what they want to do is they want to keep extracting these things, but instead of allowing foreign companies to come in and do it, they want to do it themselves, process it themselves with value added, and then export it so they can make more money. All right? But how did these people come to power? Well, you'll remember in that first pink wave, it was really the initiatives of average people taking to the streets, grassroots, democratic, social movements that led to that first pink wave of democratic governments in places like Argentina and Bolivia. The same thing is happening with this new pink wave. And so here's what I would ask you to consider. It's very tempting to look at the president of a country and oh, what are the politics of the country? But let's look at the grassroots just as much. And what we see is that the grassroots movements, these left-wing progressive movements throughout the region, are as responsible as anything for pushing Latin America to the left again. Whether it's anti-neoliberalism or environmentalist movements, indigenous rights movements, LGBTQ movements, and women's rights movements. For indigenous peoples, this is a huge issue. Indigenous peoples are often at the forefront of climate change disasters. People who find their glaciers drying up, their high altitude lakes drying up, and they have to move, which disrupts their entire culture. They lose everything that's part of their identity. Now, they can't do much about climate change, but they can do stuff about these neoliberal capitalist development schemes. So they can protest these massive pit gold and copper mining in Peru. They can protest these big hydroelectric dam projects that are built over indigenous people's lands without their consent. All right? In fact, to be an indigenous resistance person involved in environmental issues today is an incredibly deadly thing to be. Around the world, nearly 4 environmental activists are killed every week. Asia and Latin America, the deadliest places to be an environmentalist. All right? In 2020 alone, there were 165 murders of environmental activists in Latin America. Many, if not most of them, indigenous peoples. People like this woman, Berta Cáceres, in Honduras, who was trying to stop a dam from being built, flooding out her indigenous people's lands, and they had no consent in this project. They were just being literally flooded out of their lands. In Chile, the Mapuche peoples are still protesting to this day, trying to get foreign companies off of their lands, trying to get their lands back for themselves, for their own control. LGBTQ issues, another part of this big democratic push to the left. Now, there are a few countries where things like same-sex marriage are actually banned in their constitutions. But that's not the trend today. The trend today is just the opposite. As more and more same-sex rights laws are being passed across Latin America, all right? They began in Mexico City, and you'll see just through the years, until this fall, even in Cuba, 9 countries today, it's almost half, 9 countries today allow same-sex marriage in very Catholic Latin America. All right? Abortion rights are pushing this left-wing agenda. Again, in very Catholic Latin America, abortion rights are what's part of the green wave. It all began in Argentina in 2020 as feminists began wearing green, lobbying Congress to legalize abortion. Other laws in places like Ecuador and Mexico and Colombia have begun to legalize abortion rights for women in this hemisphere. These are grassroots movements forcing their countries in this direction. This is democracy from below. Right? Women's rights, particularly focused against violence against women. Violence against women is a gigantic problem in parts of Latin America. In Mexico in particular, where there's at least 1,000 recorded murders of women every year, probably twice or three times that, almost none of which are investigated. Femicide, femicide against transgendered people, or murder of transgendered people, a huge problem in places like Brazil and Mexico, the deadliest places to be a trans person on the planet as we speak. Movements to expand the rights for these people, leading to growing feminist movements all across the hemisphere. So as I conclude today, here's what I want to finish with. 11 out of 19 countries today have left-wing presidencies. Most democratically elected, some authoritarian. It's something that we saw happen 20 years ago. But in both cases, 20 years ago and today, we have to understand that it was the social movements, it was the people on the streets reacting against capitalism, fighting for women's rights, fighting for same-sex marriage, fighting for indigenous rights. It's these people who are responsible for pushing Latin America left. And with that, I'll say I'm done.
Thank you, Doctor. We'll give you a breather for 5 minutes. I have a couple announcements about some upcoming programs, and then we'll move right into the Q&A, which Mike Sutton will facilitate. Just want to announce our upcoming programs. Our next scheduled presentation will be back here at Legends on Wednesday, January the 18th, and that program's entitled The Significance of German-American Relations, a Personal Experience with James Garrett and Tabia Kuhlman. Many of you may remember James. He did a presentation for us last spring. It was a virtual presentation. He was a recent Penn State grad. This past summer, he participated in an exchange program in Germany. He spent some time in Germany. Tabia Kuhlman spent some time here in the United States. She is currently attending university in Munich. She will be presenting virtually as part of this presentation next month. James Garrett will be here. I'm not sure yet, Mike, how that's going to work, but I understand that you're in the process of working it out. So really looking forward to that presentation. Then we have another presentation in January, which is going to be a virtual presentation. That's scheduled for Thursday, the 26th. Our presenter is Philip Orlando, who's going to talk to us about inflation. Where are the winds of inflation blowing? Are we looking at a soft landing? Are we looking at a hard landing? Moving on to February, we have a virtual program scheduled for the 15th, Wednesday the 15th, by Dr. Robert Hinkle, who's going to talk to us about the media in China and Russia during the period 2014 to 2019. And then finally, back here at Legends, on Wednesday, April the 12th, Dr. Spence Stober, who's no stranger to the World Affairs Council, he's addressed us before, he's going to speak to us on climate change. We are continuing to look for presenters during this period of time, so I expect we will be back here at Legends before April. Continue to watch our website and look for your constant contact emails as reminders. I also want to let everyone know that the excursion will be back this year. We don't have a date set yet. We're going to Harrisburg, and hopefully by our next board meeting in January, we will have all of the particulars finalized that we'll be able to make an announcement. But I know many of you who have participated in our excursions in the past, and we look forward to that resuming this year. So with that, Mike, time for our Q&A.
Thank you, David. I have some ideas how the presentation in Saturdays in January is going to work. I'll be in here testing before then. We'll have it all worked out. Don't worry about it. Dr. Shaffer, excellent presentation. Thank you. We're going to take some questions from the audience, and we're going to do it just like last time. So you're going to raise your hand. I'll come to you with my microphone. You're going to have the urge to reach out and grab it from me. Don't do that. I'll hold it for you. We'll get your question in. I saw one hand go up right here, so let's get started. You stand up. You don't have to.
Most of your talk was Mexico and the South American countries. Are things different? Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, the Central American countries, where people seem to be just fleeing rather than trying to work anything out in their own countries?
Yeah. No, it's an important question. So Central American countries, those countries, between the Mexico southern border and the northern coast of South America, so we're talking Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. It depends on what country you are. Costa Rica, Panama, there really aren't any issues right now. Nothing like what we're seeing in the northern part of Central America, where we're seeing the massive fleeing of people from places, especially Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. The Salvadoran situation is El Salvador is run by a right-wing government. It's a government that perhaps has become famous or infamous for two things. One is that it's decided to make cryptocurrency a legal currency about a few months before the cryptocurrencies decided to plummet. And it's also a government that has had these very these hot and cold relationships with the street gangs that rule so much of El Salvador right now, particularly MS-13. And sometimes the government is working with the gangs, sometimes, and I say that not in a negative way, I actually say that in a positive way, in the sense that the gangs control so much of the country that the government has to work with them because they recognize them as, if not a legitimate entity, an entity that you have to negotiate with, even if it means some power sharing. In Nicaragua, you have an economic basket case that is fueled by an authoritarian leftist government who I'm not even sure is even leftist anymore, right? And people are fleeing that economic disaster. Honduras, the same thing. It seems that the migration out of Honduras might be declining a little bit. And if that's true, if that holds up, it's probably due to people hopeful that the new leftist president, Xiomara Castro, is able to do things to try and help stabilize the economy. So it kind of depends on what country you're in.
All right, we are over here stage right towards the front of the room with our next question.
Don't take it from him.
Yep.
I know.
Professors, we always want the mic. Dr. Randall Noonan from Penn State. So I wanted to ask Kirk, I'm sure a lot of the audience is wondering too, what should the U.S. policy be toward this? A lot of these governments seem fairly suspicious of the U.S., so what can or should we be doing as a country in this circumstance?
This was an issue during the first pink tide. It's an issue now that the Biden administration is having to deal with. Look, in places like Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean, the history of U.S. relations with these countries is one of invasion. It's one of support for right-wing dictatorships throughout the Cold War. There's a long history of mistrust in this region. I know Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, has been in Central America trying to negotiate better relationships, but I don't really think there's much that can be done there until the migration issue is solved. Now, in South America, the United States has less of an integrated history with South America simply because of distance. The early 20th century, the United States was invading the Caribbean basin. They weren't going into Argentina, Chile, things. But during the Cold War, the United States supported all these dictatorships. The United States supported the military when it overthrew the governments in Brazil in 64, Uruguay and Chile in 73, Argentina in 76. And there's a long lingering mistrust, particularly because a lot of these governments, these left-leaning governments today, are headed by presidents who were themselves victimized by the dictators that was supported by the U.S. So how do you overcome that? Right? How do you overcome it? One way they've been trying to do it is to reach out to China. And China has made huge inroads into the Latin American economy in the last decade, particularly looking for things like lithium and copper. So what the United States has to do is try and figure out some way to create a better trading environment, a better trust between itself and these countries, and to show that essentially they can offer a better deal than China. Now, part of that might be, look, the United States is a democracy. You're a democracy. Why do you really want to give your business to these authoritarian governments? That might be an angle to take.
We're still on your right, a few rows back. If you would introduce yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, what I was wondering was, oftentimes in more so pre-Columbian cultures in Latin America, we find that they had more, I guess you could call them left-wing values. So how would you say that the values of pre-Columbian indigenous peoples affected the modern leftist political climate of Latin America?
Really intriguing question. And you're right. Many pre-Columbian cultures before Columbus arrived in 1492, many indigenous cultures did have what we might call more communal forms of organization. Not all. We can't talk about the Aztecs this way. We can't talk about the Inca this way. They were empires. Empires don't believe in communalism. They believe in exploitation. That's why they're an empire, right? But you do have these communal ideas still percolating. So for instance, with the Mapuche in Chile, or with indigenous peoples in Honduras or in Peru, a lot of what they argue is that we deserve a certain amount of autonomy in our countries to control our own affairs, to be able to speak our languages and teach our languages in public schools, to be able to practice our religions freely, to be able to decide how our lands are organized and how the fruits of our labors are distributed. And for a lot of indigenous peoples throughout the hemisphere, again, not all, not a blanket statement here, these sort of communal values do percolate up into these indigenous resistance movements that I was talking about. So these are not just things that have just come about as far as 20th century indigenous rights movements. They do tap back into pre-Columbian culture. Yeah, thank you. It's a good question.
And here we are all the way on the other side of the room. If you would introduce yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, name's Dave Voigt. I'm a retired Tulpehocken educator. My question is, an obvious major issue is the Mexican border. X amount of thousand people come across on a daily basis. It hasn't been successfully addressed for I don't know how long. So what would you specifically do to try and fix this issue?
Easy question.
Okay, besides that being above my pay grade, okay, so look, one of the issues has to be to deal with the sources, what's pushing people to migrate, right? And those are varied. It ranges everywhere from failed economies, often these neoliberal economies that have been disastrous for people. It includes the gangs that have created such violence that people in Central America have decided it's safer to send their children alone on these caravans to try to get to the U.S. rather than be victimized by the gangs. It's also a function of climate change. As rural peoples throughout Central America are finding it ever more difficult to make a living because the rainfalls aren't as steady as they used to be. The hurricanes are more frequent and stronger, so they wash away topsoil and things like this. You can't do anything about the climate change right now. The gangs, I don't know that there's much to be done there as well. They're so large, they're so powerful, they're so transnational. It has to be a global, multinational approach. The economy, look, so many of these countries, particularly in Central America and in the Caribbean, rely on remittances. You all know what remittances are? So remittances are the monies that migrants send home. So many of these countries' GDPs have between a third and two-thirds of their GDPs are based upon remittances coming back from the United States. If you were to stop the migration, you're stopping that money flow back to their homelands. Do you really want to see that economic destabilization now? There is no, I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, this will get me booze, I'm sure, but look, if neoliberal capitalists want their say, want their way, if they want free and open borders for the flow of goods and services, then we need free and open borders for the flow of people, too.
All right, I'm getting a workout. We're here all the way in the back with your next question. If your name and question, please.
My name is Louise Grimm. I'm a community activist, and I wondered if you could expand a little bit more on what's happening in Peru right now with the recent, whatever you want to call it, deposition of the prime minister.
Yes. So until a few days ago, the president was a man by the name of Pedro Castillo. He was elected with a plurality of the vote. And he was a very interesting person. He was a school teacher from a very rural, poor area, unlike any kind of president that Peru had ever had, right? Well, he's gone through something like 80 cabinet ministers in a year. So people are like, well, how effective of a political leader is he? And I think that's a very fair point. But he was also dealing with a Congress that was dominated, not completely, because he had supporters in the Congress, a Congress that was dominated by people who represent not the poor, like he did, but the old guard, the wealthy, who had never seen a poor president, a president representing the poor in power before. And so what's happened is the Congress tried to impeach him. The latest charge was something on, he was an immorality charge. And so as this latest impeachment was coming down, he decided that he was going to declare a state of emergency, abolish Congress, all right, which is, never looks good, right? Abolish Congress, and then call for new elections and the writing of a brand new constitution, which is exactly what had happened in the country just south of Peru in Chile over the past couple of years. So when he did this, Congress impeached him again. He was arrested. We think he was arrested on his way to the Mexican embassy where he was going to try and get asylum. But he was arrested, and now he's in jail awaiting charges. The government just said yesterday they want to hold him for 3 years without trial, exactly. And how's the rest of Latin America responding? Well, most of Latin America, particularly these leftist countries, these other 10 leftist countries, are with him. They support him. They say he should be put back into the presidency, that he was actually illegally removed from the presidency, all right? So there's all kinds of, sort of extra constitutional maneuvers going on both sides here. The Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, said, yes, I'd be happy to give you asylum. And this is what he did in Bolivia when Evo Morales was overthrown a few years ago. And Mexico is where, historically, Latin American opposition politicians have gone into exile. So that's the latest I know of from the news wires this morning.
And we're back here on your right-hand side. Sorry, your left-hand side, my right-hand side. Got a pair of student questions. We'll start here. Your name and question, please.
I'm Kira Kemp. I'm from Muhlenberg School. And I was wondering, do you believe the current leftist trends of the Latin American government will persist, or do you think that there might be a dip back into the right side?
It's, I think, the obvious question. and I'm surprised it hasn't been asked because it's important. Is it just a pendulum, right? Is it just going to swing left, right, left, right, left, right? There's a distinct possibility, and I say that because even though the rise of these left-wing movements, these left-wing presidencies, is itself based upon these social movements, whether it's women's rights, LGBTQ rights, indigenous rights, etc., those groups also do not have economic power. The peoples with the economic power are the ones that try to swing things back to the right. And I wouldn't be surprised if, in fact, that's where we are again, at least within the next election cycle. Yeah.
And we are in the middle of the room. I have another student question. Say your name and ask your question, please.
I'm Dave from Muhlenberg School District. And excuse my lack of context, but is a political change like this, is this seen as more rapid or gradual?
I think we have the impression that if we're doing some sort of electoral democracy and change comes through the ballot box, we kind of think of this as sort of a gradual evolution. Even in a place like Brazil and their election in October, it was a pretty close election, much closer than we thought it would be, maybe 4 or 5 percentage points, I think. So I think this tends to be more evolutionary. Though we have seen points where it has been much more rapid and punctuated. For instance, those social movements that sprung up in the early 2000s that led to the water wars in Bolivia, that led to the factory takeovers in Argentina. But they were responding to right-wing governments in power. So, you know, it's kind of really hard to say, but I suspect that we're going to see a pendulum swing, and it's simply going to be sort of a gradual approach. I don't see the military stepping in. I don't see any revolutionary uprising of people in arms or anything like that.
And staying here in the middle of the room, your name and question, please. My microphone.
Walter Acksmith. I'm under the impression there's really not much difference between your leftist and rightist authoritarian governments.
Between right-wing and left-wing authoritarian governments? Yeah, it's a fair observation, and I would say there is one. Right-wing authoritarian governments historically in Latin America rarely try and rule in the name of the people. Left-wing authoritarian governments do. And so right-wing authoritarian governments tend to create conditions that allow for neoliberal capitalism. Neoliberalism, the Washington Consensus, the first 2 countries where this was experimented on were in Chile and Argentina during the dictatorships in the 1970s. This is where it began, right? So yes, from the power structure, from the top down, yes, we have authoritarianism, but to whom do they rule? For whom are they ruling, right? Are they ruling for the interest of a few or for the interest of the many? And maybe that becomes more rhetoric than reality, but at least the rhetoric gives you an idea of what the goal is and the possibility of something carrying through.
And still here in front of you, don't worry, my people on the left-hand side, I haven't forgotten about you. Have a question, just raise your hand. Another student question here. Please say your name and ask your question.
My name is Francis, and I know in your talk that you said that so many of these Latin American countries are rooted in Catholicism. Mm-hmm. And with the decline of Catholicism in Latin America, I was wondering if there's any correlation between the left-wing movements and how that impacts.
No, it's a great question. Yes, there has over the last 30 years been an increase in Protestantism, Protestant evangelicalism in particular, all across the board. I remember I was in Havana in the 90s, and I was having breakfast with a U.S. Baptist minister who was setting up a Baptist church in communist Cuba. So you get all kinds of interesting things like this happening. but so yes, there has been an increase in Protestantism. The Catholic Church is still dominant, but I've never seen anything that necessarily links Protestantism with these social movements, primarily because these Protestant churches themselves tend to be even more conservative and reactionary than the Catholic Church, not necessarily leftist or progressive.
And back a little bit more on your right-hand side. I have another question here. Your name and the question, please.
My name. I'm not a good observer of all the Latin American countries, but what I observe here is that LGBT, the women's right to the land, they're fundamental issues. Will the left be able to deliver that?
I'm sorry, I did not catch
Will
that.
the left government, they're dictators themselves, will they be able to deliver all those hopes and aspirations of the people?
Will these left-wing governments deliver the hopes and aspirations of the social movements? So, look, they talk about it, and yet, look, I study the Latin American left, but I particularly study the far left, people who are further left than anybody you ever saw on these slides today. And they are very critical of these leftist governments. They believe that they're slow to enact indigenous rights reforms. They believe that they criticize these governments for continuing these extractive, export-based economies. They criticize these left-wing governments for their links to Russia and China. How can you be pro-democracy and yet be relying on these authoritarian governments? The far left criticizes these governments for seeking to actually de-radicalize the social movements. This is one of the great fears in Brazil. Lula, who is the head of the Workers' Party, was just elected in 2020 in October, and the fear on the far left is that he's going to try and use his control over the unions and the party to de-radicalize these other social movements. And they're very critical, the left is very critical of Mexico's president, AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who they say is too slow in trying to stem violence against women in Mexico, and who they continue to criticize for really working with President Trump to really fulfill Trump's immigration policies, keeping migrants in Mexico, and Biden, who has continued that policy. So there's a great deal of uncertainty, questioning, perhaps disillusion within the left, within the radical left, and within the social movements, that these governments aren't as radical as perhaps they wish they were.
Thank you so much for your presentation today, Dr. Shaffer.
Thank you.
With that, we will bring WAC President David Bean back onto the stage.